Sorry. Just to go over some housekeeping rules, I'm Jacqueline Hawes, the Director of Communications and Business Development here at the Battleship Missouri. Just please remember to mute yourself throughout the presentation. If you have any questions, please use the chat box feature to drop any questions in, and we'll do a little Q&A at the end, which I will facilitate. Your best viewing is going to be in speaker view, so you can see the full presentation from Ryan. And lastly, sit back and grab a cup of coffee and enjoy. First, I want to introduce our President and CEO, Mike Carr, who will be sharing a little bit more backgrounds about our guest speaker today and what you can expect.
Hi, well, good morning or good afternoon or good evening, wherever you may be here on Zoom. It's great to have you here for our first Mojo presentation of 2024. I'm very looking forward eagerly to hearing Ryan Zemansky. I've known Ryan for 15 years, which is as long as I've been here at the Battleship Missouri. Ryan is the Curatorial and Educational Affairs Vice President for the Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. And for some of you may know, he's also the star of the Battleship New Jersey YouTube videos, which are very interesting. And I encourage all of you to go to YouTube and listen to Ryan. Ryan is also the Executive Director of the Historic Naval Ships Association, which includes about 130 or so historic ships across the country and some international destinations as well. And so it is my great pleasure. We went through Drydock about 15 years ago, so I'm eager to hear what Ryan's experiences have been so far, and we'll be watching them very closely over the course of the next couple of months to see what their experiences have been, because this is something that Missouri is going to have to address probably 5 or 6 years from now again. So without further ado, let me turn it over to my friend, Ryan Zemansky.
Thank you very much, Mike. Thank you guys all for coming to listen to me talk about dry docking. Especially I'd like to thank Owen Riley. I know you saw this presentation a couple of days ago when I gave it here on the Battleship. But good to see everyone here. I'm going to share my screen here in a minute. So today's presentation, we're going to talk about our plans as they exist to go into dry docking. I actually took my inspiration for crafting this presentation off of how some of the presentations that Mike Carr presents, where he goes through and he answers all of the questions he normally gets up front in the presentation. So I'm going to try and do that today by going through the common questions and then look at what some of the project looks like. We have taken a lot of our influence for this project off of Missouri's 2009 dry docking. We've absolutely been talking with the staff there in Hawaii and learning from the lessons that you guys had the last time you did it. And our project will probably look very similar to those of you who were around back then. So first off, when is this happening? Too soon. We are planning on towing the ship away from her current berth here in Camden on March 21st. So that is about a month from today. We're going to go over to a couple miles down the river to another berth called Paulsboro Marine Terminal that's a little bit deeper than where we're sitting today. And that's where we're going to do the ballasting of the ship. Just like you guys are out of trim, we're about 10 feet higher in the bow than we are in the stern. And if an Iowa-class battleship tries to go into dry dock more than 3.81 feet out of trim, we will set down on our rudder and propellers and crush that sensitive part of the ship. So you guys were gracious enough to give us the information you had on how much water you put in your forward tanks. It ended up being about 500,000 gallons or 2,000 tons to bring the ship down to about 2 or 3 feet out of trim. And you guys flooded 18 forward tanks and voids in order to do that. We're looking at doing that exact same thing. So that's going to start on March 22nd. And we're hoping on concluding that evolution on March 26th, so that on March 27th, we can actually go onto the blocks. And I'll talk more about where we're going onto the blocks here in a second. We're planning on having a 60-day yard period. You guys were in the dry dock for about 90 days back in 2009, and we're doing a slightly smaller scope of work that I'll talk about in a minute. So the next big question we always get is, can you come and see the ship while she's in the yard? And the answer is yes. We have the yard's permission to do tours of the ship on the weekends while we're there. So you will be able to come down into the dry dock. We're going to do hour-long tours every weekend that we're there in the dry dock. There are a finite number of tickets because they limit how many people can be in the dry dock at a time. And they limit us to daylight hours. So essentially we can only have, it's roughly 5,000 people come through during the 2 months that we're going to be in the yard. Those tickets sell for $225. You can check them out on our website, battleshipnewjersey.org, or if you want to take the tour with me, it's $1,000. The next question we always get is, can I ride the ship? And the short answer to this question is no. There will be very limited staff on the ship when we tow her to Paulsboro and then into the yard. Nobody has seen the underside of this ship since 1991 when she was dry docked as part of her inactivation process. So the Coast Guard and our insurance both want as small a number of people on board the ship as possible. We have some hopes to let people on the ship when we tow her back to Camden at the end of the yard period, but that is very much going to depend on what happens in the yard and what the Coast Guard and the insurance say at the end of that period. So stay tuned. Hopefully we'll be able to do that in the future. Can we get on the ship while she's in the yard? No, you're not going to be able to take tours of the ship, just of the dry dock around the ship. Many of our critical life safety things like exit signs and alarm systems are going to be disconnected when the ship loses power. And we're honestly not sure how much of that is going to come back up online when we plug into shore power at the yard. They have significantly less juice than we have here at the pier. Iowa-class battleships have 8 440-volt shore power cables, and the yard that we're going to only has 4. So that's going to limit the amount of power that we have on the ship. So the next question I always get is, well, what have other large ships done? Are you imitating what they're doing? And the short answer is yes, absolutely. We are talking to all of the other capital ships to find out what they have done, and so that we can learn from their lessons. Like I said, I've talked to Les there at Missouri a number of times now. I've asked Franklin for a ton of documentation that you guys have been able to pull from your collections to help us fill in the blanks with some of the documents that, for whatever reason, we did not inherit along with the ship. We've made it down to Texas now 3 or 4 times to see the ongoing work during their much larger yard period, and we've learned a tremendous amount from them. And we've gone and visited some of these other museum ships and seen the work that they've done. Interestingly, Texas, Massachusetts, and Missouri are currently the only 3 out of the 8 museum battleships that have been dry docked as museums. The rest of them have not. Some of them, because they're grounded, have been able to do yard work in situ, but only 3 out of the 8 battleships, and when we go, it'll only be half of the battleships, have managed to dry dock. It's even worse if you look at the carriers. Only 1 out of the 5 aircraft carriers has made it into dry dock, and only 1 out of the 3 museum cruisers in this country have made it into dry dock as museums. So because of the cost, it is kind of rare for ships like ours to go into dry dock. And it's very fortunate that Missouri, New Jersey, and some of these other ones have, because I feel like we're going to have a lot less maintenance issues down the line than these other ships. So why are we doing this? We're looking at about a $10 million project here. So why are we going through the trouble? Well, we've got a ton of manuals that say that it's what the best thing to do is. The Navy's Chapter 50 of the Naval Ships Technical Manual, maintenance of inactive vessels, says that you're supposed to put an inactive vessel in the yard every 20 years. Since we haven't been in since 91, we're looking at 33 years since we were last out of the water. Other documents like the Secretary of the Interior's Standards for Historic Vessel Preservation also say that this is something we need to be doing. Like I said, the Navy requires it. That they don't really follow up and penalize you if you don't, but they expect good stewards of their vessels to be dry docking their ships. One of the reasons that we're doing it now before we spring any major leaks is because, like I said, the price is only $10 million. If we wait until we get a leak, we're going to look like Texas, who's currently in there for $65 million. So we definitely want to do this now while the ship is 81 years young, as opposed to in 20 or 30 years when she's broken the century mark and she has holes all over the place, and it's just such a prohibitive number that we'd never be able to afford it. And we're doing this because of what we've looked at other ships, the maintenance issues that they're having because they haven't dry docked, or the successes they've had because they have. And then finally, we're looking at the thickness of the hull. Remember the other year when USS the Sullivans foundered at her moorings? The shell plating on a Fletcher-class destroyer like hers is only 1/16 of an inch thinner than at the bow of an Iowa-class battleship. And she was built the exact same year as New Jersey. She's only 1 year older than Missouri. So if a ship like that with a 3/8 shell plating sprung a bunch of leaks, then we're probably down to a 1/16 of an inch thick or less where we've had wastage at our bows. So we've got to go now before we get holes, because we won't be able to afford it once we do get holes. Now, dry docking is kind of a last resort for museum ships. So we looked at a number of different alternatives in the planning of this process. And I should talk about that part of why we're doing this now also has to do with the national celebration that's going to take place in Philadelphia in 2025 and 2026. 2025 is the 250th anniversary of the founding of the Navy and Marine Corps, which took place here in Philadelphia. And of course, 2026 is the 250th anniversary of the founding of the country. So we want the ship to look as good as possible for when those celebrations happen. We're expecting tens of millions of visitors to come to the Philadelphia area. And we're hoping to get some of those visitors to bring their money across the river to New Jersey here. So we want the ship to look good, and we want it to last for a long time. So alternatives we looked at are a permanent cofferdam. The picture on my left here with the 55 on it, that's USS North Carolina. She has a permanent cofferdam built around her berth so they can do hull repairs in situ. Notice that they're replacing the shell plating at the bow where it's super thin. They had a leak there, similar to how Missouri had a leak there when you guys had to go into dry dock. We do not yet have a leak there, but we want to get it before we do. The picture on the other side is a movable cofferdam like they're using on USS Olympia. That's the ship pictured in this photograph. Yorktown and Iowa have also adopted similar cofferdams. And essentially, a full permanent cofferdam like North Carolina, you can drain it and work on the whole hull. A movable cofferdam like this, you're working on the hull 1 4-foot section at a time. It takes about 2 weeks to sandblast and then put a full system of coatings on that 4-foot section of hull before you have to move again. Well, remember, our ships are something like 1,700 feet if you go all the way around the water line. So 4 feet at a time. And we are not in Hawaii where we've got perfect weather year round. We've got maybe 6 months of good weather where we can do exterior painting. So we were looking at something like a 20-year project to paint the entire waterline of the ship using a cofferdam. So that just wasn't possible. But by the time we got to some sections of the hull would be 100 years old, and we'd have all sorts of additional issues. Another option, of course, is just consumption of the artifact. We could choose to not go into dry dock and just use the ship until she's completely wasted away and then sell her for scrap. And obviously, that would not be good stewardship of this ship, which is an artifact in the museum's collection. So that wasn't really an option that we considered. So once we decided that dry docking was our only option, we wanted to determine what type of dry docking we were going to go into. Coast Guard Cutter 37 here, Taney, is a ship that I previously got to work on in dry dock. She's on a marine railway, which is a really cool thing. It's like an elevator that lifts the ship up, and it's sort of sitting on a train car that they can use to move around a parking lot, essentially. So that was really interesting to see. The Coast Guard does that at their yard in Curtis Bay. We couldn't find anything like that for a 45,000-ton Iowa-class battleship, though, so that one was out of the way. Texas, the other battleship you see pictured here, is in a floating dry dock. So that was pretty cool. They were actually looking at dry docks overseas because they couldn't find one in this country that was going to let them be in there for the 12 months they needed without it being completely cost prohibitive. And fortunately, Gulf Copper was able to acquire a brand new floating dry dock for them to use so that they didn't have to go somewhere like, actually, Ukraine was one of the places they were talking about for cheap labor. That would have gone very poorly. Korea was another option for them. So fortunately, they were able to do it right in Galveston, where they're planning on having the ship end up at the end of her yard period. But we would have to tow the ship further to get to a floating dry dock where the river was actually deep enough for the floating dry dock to submerge under us than we do to have to go into the dry dock that we're actually going to go into. So that ended up being a non-factor. A ship lift is another type. It's kind of similar to the marine railway where you just drag the ship up onto dry land. I've worked on ships in a ship lift before. Again, not possible for a ship the size of ours. So that leaves us with a graving dock, which is essentially you dig out a hole in the land and you can flood that and drain it. And so the Missouri went into a graving dock. That's what Dry Dock 4 there at Pearl Harbor was. That's what we're going to have to do. So once we decided that a graving dock was our only option, we had to look around for which one we could go into. And Iowa-class battleships can only fit in something like 10 in this country. It's not just their length and width that limit them. It's the weight of the stern of the ship. There's so much weight in armor and turret 3 that's all concentrated on the twin docking keels that hold the internal propellers that many dry docks can't handle that weight concentrated on such a small area. So fortunately for you guys, dry dock number 4 was able to do that. And I understand from the Navy that that's one of the things that went into selecting Hawaii as the successful applicant for Missouri becoming a museum ship and being housed there in Pearl Harbor. Likewise, one of the reasons why the Navy agreed on Camden as the final home of New Jersey was because we have easy access to the former Philadelphia Navy Yard. Dry dock number 3 at Philadelphia is where New Jersey was originally put into dry dock when she was under construction. She actually went in there twice in 1942 and 1943 while she was being built. And it's where she was reactivated in 1967 before she went to Vietnam. So we know the dry dock can handle us. It's currently operated Again, it was Navy Yard then. It's currently operated by a private company, Northeastern Ship Repair. And we reached out to them and said, hey, can we please, like, we're a poor museum. Can you work with us? And they were so excited to bring us home, and they were so excited for the PR opportunities that they gave us an extremely good rate. Like I said, this project's going to end up being about $10 million. We're looking at spending about $7 million with them in the actual dry dock portion of it. The other money is prep work and tow and all that sort of stuff. But they gave us a very competitive rate compared to some of the other bids we looked at dry docks. In theory, dry dock number 4 over there, which is actually run by a separate company, can also take an Iowa-class battleship. Wisconsin went in there in 88 or 89, but their price was nowhere near as competitive as dry dock number 3. And finally, if you see that red push pin right there, that is the covered slipways where New Jersey and Wisconsin were built side by side. So you can see that it's right next to dry dock number 3, where we're going to go into the dry dock. So at the end of the day, that was really our first choice, and we're very fortunate that we were able to work out an arrangement with them. So who all is involved in this process? For those of you who did this project on Missouri or have worked on other museum ships, you probably already know this list. Obviously, the museum is the biggest stakeholder. The yard that we're going into is a stakeholder. The Secretary of the Navy and NAVSEA are also stakeholders. We had to get their permission to move the ship. They haven't been too involved in requirements or anything like that, but we have to keep them appraised of what we're doing. The Coast Guard captain of the port is the one who sets all the guidelines for moving the ship. Our insurance company, the yard's insurance company, probably some other insurance companies have all been very vocal in this process. We've had to get a number of engineers, surveyors, marine folks engaged in this project. And then, of course, the various contractors that us or the yard are contracting with to do the various projects. So there are a ton of moving pieces that we're juggling right now. I've already told you our timeline as it stands. And we think, weather permitting, that timeline is going to work. Now that we're so close to it, we can say that it's going to work. Our original timeline was actually to go into the yard in January when we had the lease visitation. But the ship that was in the yard ahead of us, her dry docking was delayed, which ended up bumping us back. So the only thing that could limit us right now are the Coast Guard captain of the port's requirements. If it is too foggy, if the visibility isn't, I think it's 2 miles or less, they're going to cancel the tow. And if the wind is 25 knots or more, they're going to cancel the tow. But besides those two things, there shouldn't be anything at this point that stops us from doing the initial tow on the 21st, ballasting, and then going into the yard on the 27th. And of course, when we're going to come out, like I said, we're planning on a 60-day yard period, but who knows? Once we get her out of the water, having not seen the bottom of the ship since 91, we could find something that causes our 60-day yard period to turn into a 90-day yard period pretty easily. So we have not publicized an undocking date yet, but it'll most likely be around the 81st anniversary of our commissioning on May 23rd. So our major phases are the preparatory phase, which is complete, the pier side work that we're still working on, moving, and then some of the projects we're doing in there, actually in the yard. There were 2 major components to our preparatory phase once we'd actually gone through all the work and identified what yard we wanted to go to and what scope of work we wanted to do. Those were a dive survey. Like I said, nobody's seen the underwater hull of this ship since 91. So we sent some divers down. They looked at the underside, and they helped us refine what our dry docking proposal was. And I'll tell you some of the things that they came up with when I talk about the projects later on. The second major thing was a bathygraphic survey. So we wanted to see how deep the river around the ship was. At the very top of this chart, you can see the ship channel, and that's 45 feet deep, even at mean low tide. We draw 34 feet of water right now, so we're pretty good. We know that our berth is 34 feet deep. We take soundings with the sounding lead off the side of the ship every quarter just to make sure we haven't silted in. And so we know that that was good. And the dive survey was able to confirm that. What we did not know was if any sort of berm had built up between the ship and the channel. Intrepid got into a lot of trouble when they dry docked her a couple of years ago because they were good, they sounded the channel, they were good. They pulled the ship off of the pier and boom, she ran aground and was stuck for weeks. They ended up having to spend millions of dollars on Navy divers, I think the Army Corps of Engineers, and everybody else to help dredge under the ship to get her to dry dock. And then that delayed her whole dry docking process. She was closed for much longer. Like I said earlier, we are learning from what other ships have done because we can't afford not to. One of the major pierside projects that we had to start with, and one that I don't think you guys had to worry about, was removing the SPS-49 air search radar antenna and the mast. Our ship has an air draft of about 176 feet on her current draft markings. The bridge that we have to get under to get to the dry dock is only 150 feet tall. So we had to cut off 46 feet of mast, remove the big radar antenna, and 3 other dipole antennas up on the yards to be able to get the ship's air draft low enough to fit under the bridge with enough of a margin of safety that the Coast Guard captain of the port and the folks who operate the bridge were willing to sign off on it. So that was a major project, and that was really the kickoff project for this period, because before we figured out how to do that, there was no possible way we could do this. The next major thing we're going to work on, what we're currently in the middle of, is removing connections. I forgot to mention earlier, we're already closed to the public. We're going to be closed to the public from now until we move the ship. And during this time period, we're removing all the connections. We've already removed one of our 2 gangways just to get it out of the way. Everything requires a crane. And so the various contractors' cranes were going to be interfering with each other. So we had to very granularly phase out when each of these projects was going to happen. First, we have to disconnect the heating boiler. Then we have to put a new heating boiler on the ship that's temporary so that none of the pipes freeze, because we still get snow here in February and March. We have to disconnect the fire main. We have to disconnect power, water, the other gangway. So we are currently in the middle of this process as we speak. And then the next big thing is going to be the tow. Actually, one of my meetings today was with the tugboat captain for McAllister, who's going to do the tow. We're going to have 4 boats. One's going to be on our hip, providing the power. They've got 16,000 horsepower. That is enough that if it was an Iowa-class battleship, we could get up to 15.5 knots, our most economical cruising speed. Of course, it's a fraction of the 212,000 horsepower we could develop if we were running our own engines. So one boat will be at our hip doing most of the movement. There will be a boat each at the bow and the stern, and they're going to be our rudder. They're going to bump us one way or the other to actually turn us. And then we'll have a 4th boat on standby in case we need them somewhere else. We're going to be entering the dry dock. The blocking plan here is how it will be lined up for us. I believe these are from your dry docking in dry dock number 4. Every time New Jersey has gone into dry dock number 3 here in Philadelphia in the past, all 3 times we went in bow first. This time we're going to go in stern first like you guys were. And we're doing that for one simple reason. For the last 20 years, we've been using the shore power connections on the starboard side. We have no idea if the shore power connection box on the port side still works. We're not even going to mess with it. They have shore power on the right-hand wing wall, so we're going to put the ship aft in so that our starboard side matches up with their shore power. We are planning on fleeting the ship once. One of the very critical documents that you guys shared with us was your blocking plan from when you went into the yard. The Navy's blocking plan is for fleeting the ship twice, which means there's roughly 306 4-foot by 4-foot, 6-ton keel blocks that support an Iowa-class battleship when she goes on dry dock. When we paint the ship, we're going to paint everything but that area under the blocks. So because that area hasn't been painted in 30 years, and because it's going to be another 30 years before we make it into dry dock, we're going to flood the dry dock again halfway through the project, move the ship 4 feet, set her back down again, and then paint those sections that we had missed previously. So again, because you guys shared your documentation, we're only going to do that once. That's going to save us about $150,000. Blasting and painting, we're going to do an ultra-high pressure water pressure wash of the hull. We're only going to work on the water line down. It's cheaper for us to do work above water pier side. So this entire $10 million project is going to focus exclusively on the exterior below water hull. So we're going to blast that whole area to white metal. We're going to put a system of coatings on. We're not going to use anti-fouling paint because we're not moving. So we're saving a lot of money by just using regular epoxy paints. Yeah, oh man, I can't remember the number. I did the math. It was something like 15 tons of paint that we're going to end up putting on the ship. If I find those numbers before the end of this presentation, I'll speak up. One of the we've only got 3 projects. I keep telling people this is a really, really simple project. There's only 3 things that we need to do. We need to paint the bottom of the ship. We need to check out the 165 through hull openings, and we need to change out our anodes. Those are the only 3 projects we're doing. So some of the openings are things like the gland seals here. This is the port side outboard propeller shaft where it passes through the hull. And that rope-looking thing you see on the bottom is the packing material that keeps that water tight but allows it to spin as needed. You would do about 5 loops of that around the shaft, and then you see these nuts and bolts around it. You crank those down to hold it in place. That's good for about 20 years for a stationary vessel. Again, ours is going on 30 years, so we're absolutely going to replace those. You see all the like bright blue in this picture? That is corrosion. So we're going to be addressing that while we're there. So we obviously don't want this to corrode and allow water in. The last ship I put into dry dock had a leaky gland seal in one of her propeller shafts that ate through the bilge and caused a significant amount of damage and flooding to that vessel. So we're going to avoid that now by going into the yard ahead of time. The other through hull openings are like this one. This is inside of the main condenser for number 2 engine in number 3 engine room. This is the this is where the water leaves the condenser and goes back into the ocean. You can see that steel plate down there is one of the blanks that the Navy welded on when the ship was mothballed. That is the first one to have failed. You notice this thin little garden hose in the middle? We couldn't actually patch the hole. So what we did is we put a garden hose over the hole and we ran it 30 feet up out of the engine room until it was above the water line. And that fooled the leak, which was going to try and flood that entire engine room until it reached equilibrium with the outside river. It fooled the leak into thinking that it had done that, even though it's only flooded the garden hose and not the whole ship. Obviously, that is not a great permanent fix. So that is the one hole that we have found in the ship so far, and that was the come to Jesus moment when we said, hey, the blanks that the Navy put on this ship are thinner than the shell plating. One of them has failed already. There are 164 more that could fail, and every time that happens, ka-ching, 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 to add another $100,000 to $1 million onto the dry docking, depending on how much it is. So that was one of the things that really made us kick our butts into high gear and decide we were going to do this dry docking now instead of waiting another 10 years. And then finally, replacing the anodes. The other 3 Iowa-class battleships got an impressed current cathodic protection system installed in the late 1980s. New Jersey never did. Our cathodic protection relies on 1,204 of these 23-pound zinc anodes. The ship's hull is made out of a number of materials, including 3 different types of steel and the manganese bronze propellers and a bunch of other metals. So the least noble metal is going to corrode in order to save the most noble metal. So what that would normally mean is the propellers are perfectly fine. That bronze is very noble. It's going to be fine. But the steel propeller shaft that it's sitting on is going to waste away to save it. So what the Navy did by bolting 1,204 of these anodes around the bilge keels and the propellers is the zinc will corrode in place of the steel. However, look at this blank that we removed. Look at how intact that zinc is. A zinc is supposed to last 10 years before it needs to be replaced. Ours have been on there for 30 years. But that zinc is still perfectly intact. It's over 90% intact. That means it's not working. So that was another come to Jesus moment that our dive survey revealed. Our cathodic protection system has not been working because when the Navy installed it, we were supposed to be in salt water. When we were decommissioned, we were sent to Bremerton alongside Missouri, and we were in salt water. But for the last 20 years, we've been sitting in freshwater. So really, we're supposed to have aluminum anodes on the hull. So when we saw this was another one of those things that were like, okay, we've got to take her into the yard and we've got to replace all of these with a new type of anode that is actually going to work so that these disposable things are being consumed and not the hull of the primary artifact of this museum. We have a ton of lesser projects where if we're able to fundraise above the $10 million that it's going to take to move the ship and then do those 3 projects I just talked about, we would love to do. This is from when I got to participate in Slater's dry docking a couple of years ago. You can't really see it because my photographs are kind of garbage, but the red thing circled there is a box that they welded where the propeller shaft leaves the hull. And that takes the strain of the propeller shaft off of the gland seal. Essentially, in service, the props are supposed to spin. So that's distributing the weight around the gland seal. Yours and ours have not spun in 30 years. So all of the weight of the propeller is crushing down on the lowest part of the gland seal, and it's opening up a hole at the higher part of the gland seal. Again, it takes about 20 years for that to cause an issue. But with how much this is costing us and for the debt service on some of the loans that we've taken out to do this project, it's going to take 30 years to pay it off. So we're not going to be able to fundraise for an additional dry docking for another 30 years. So if we're able to get more money, we're going to box the shafts like Slater did. Another thing that I'm super self-conscious about, for $10 million, we're going to bring the ship back and people aren't going to see any change. because all the work will have happened below the water. So I'm super worried that people are going to come back to us and be like, hey, what did we donate money to? I don't see any benefit. So I would love to paint the visible hull while we're in the yard if possible. And there's a couple other things. If we could get new mooring lines, if we could replace our 20-year-old shore power connections, our storm mooring chains, all those things, those would be great add-ons if we can raise an extra $200,000 or $500,000, depending on the project. So we've absolutely talked to contractors and gotten prices for all of these things. We're just not sure we'll be able to do it yet. Of course, the final part of the project is going to be leaving the dock. I didn't have any pictures of New Jersey doing that, so I had to use pictures of you guys. But we're hoping that's going to happen, like I said, sometime in late May. There will probably be about a 2-week window after that where we're getting the ship ready to open, and we're hoping on being open again in early to mid-June. So the costs. Like I said, it's about $10 million. The tow company has donated most of their services. A lot of the contractors are donating their services. We're probably spending half of what we should be spending on this project because so many people are working with us and donating their services. When I come back on the Mojo in 3 or 4 months and talk about what we actually did during the project, I'll be able to have a better idea of what the actual costs were. This slide has been in here since I wrote this presentation a couple of months ago, and I keep intending to put the costs on there, but they keep changing because the scope of work keeps changing slightly. So I'm just going to power on through this slide without addressing anything else in more detail. Where's our money coming from? We were supremely fortunate to get $5 million from the state of New Jersey for this project. Without that, we wouldn't be doing it. We spend about $5 million a year, and we make about $3 million a year, and we get about $2 million of support a year from the state. So that allows us to just operate like normal. To do a capital project like $5 million of replacing the deck or $10 million of going into dry dock, we really depend on grants and state aid and things like that. So would have been June of last year that the state budget added an extra $5 million to us for 2024. And that's when we said, all right, we can actually start signing contracts with people. We were able to get a bond from the county. Huge problem. The ship is really the museum's only asset. But because of our contract with the Navy, we can't use that as collateral on loans. So the county was able to give us a $3.25 million guarantee on a loan so that we have enough money to go into dry dock. We have currently made something like $500,000 on donations from folks. We're probably looking at somewhere between $2 and $3 million worth of in-kind donations so far and rising. And plans for fundraising in dry dock. Like I said earlier, we've already sold $200,000 worth of dry docking tours. And if we sell out all of the slots that we have, we'll end up raising something like $1.2 million additional dollars. And all of this money goes directly back into dry docking the ship. So like I said, I think we're somewhere around $9.25 right now, which is enough to do everything that we have planned. And all of this extra stuff that we get during the project is just going to allow us to go to our menu of things that we wanted to add and say, all right, we'd like to add painting the above water hull. We'd like to add cleaning out the ship's 3 CHT tanks. We'd like to, yeah, you know how it goes. This slide went into this presentation before we had permission to do dry docking tours. So obviously dry docking tours are going to be a huge fundraising opportunity that we're able to do. And the other major one that we're still trying to work on, like I said earlier in the presentation, we're hoping we can allow people to ride the ship when she comes back to her berth, but we're not entirely sure yet. So that is what we know as of today for the dry docking that's happening next month. Does anybody have any questions?
Thank you, Ryan. That was very informative. A great presentation, by the way. A lot of people are asking if they'll be able to get a copy of this. We did record it, so we will be emailing it to all participants following the presentation. To get us kick-started with the questions, please make sure that everyone puts their questions into the chat room, and I will facilitate here. I do have one to kind of get us started, Ryan, if you have some time. What do you expect to see, like after you get the USS New Jersey on the blocks? What do you actually expect to see when you take her out of the water?
That's a great question. Fortunately, we have a collection of photographs that was taken by, some of you guys will recognize his name, Richard Landgraf, who also went by the name of Rusty Battleships on all the forums. He was the chief engineer at Long Beach when New Jersey and Missouri were reactivated in the 80s. So he had some pictures of us in dry dock from that time period that is really our best guess of what to expect when we get her out of the water. But ultimately, we have no idea. What I'm most afraid of seeing, according to those pictures, our bow forward of frame 50, which is the forward armored bulkhead, was bent up 2 inches above the keel blocks, just because it's so much less buoyant there that it sort of just bent up. So I'm worried that since we're 10 feet higher in the bow than we should be, because there's no weight up there, that we're going to see similar or worse bending there, which means that we might find cracks in some of the tanks up forward around, I think it was frame 16 that they found some severe cracks in the 80s. So I'm hoping not to find those, but that's what keeps me up at night right now.
Understandable. Another question we have from our chat, and I was kind of curious too, what will guests expect to see or experience on the dry docking tours?
Oh, great question. The dry docking tours are going to be an hour long, and we're basically going to do a full lap of the ship. So while we're down there, and photographs will be allowed. So you can take pictures of yourself underneath of the tunnel, between the shafts, at the bow, all that stuff. You'll be able to see where our paravane mounting bracket was removed from the bow, unlike yours. You'll be able to see all of our propellers. They're still on there. Our docking keels, where some repairs were made to those in the 80s. All the zinc anodes that we still have to have because we never got the impressed current system that they put on you guys.
Thank you. Another question from our chat room. You mentioned that you weren't putting any bottom paint on the hull. Do you have a hull cleaning schedule, or are you be implementing one to combat growth in the future?
Okay. Yeah, so we are doing a system of coatings on the hull. It's going to end up being something really high built, like 30 mils thick, or 30 or 40 mils thick, I think was the total system. It's 4 or 5 coats, not counting the stripe coating and other things like that. We really don't experience much growth on the hull here because we're so far up the river and we're in fresh water. We're really expecting to evaluate, once we get the ship out of the water, how much growth we're seeing and how much that has damaged the system of coatings that's on the ship before we determine what our cleaning schedule is going to be. We have never cleaned the bottom of the ship since we've been here. But we know that you guys in Wisconsin do have a cleaning schedule and have worked with some companies. So we've actually started talking with them to see what it would cost to come up here and do us on a 2-year basis or 5-year basis. We just haven't determined that yet. And when you have me back on in a couple of months, I'll have a better answer for you.
Sounds great. Another question is, what is your actual role in this entire dry docking process?
Believe it or not, we do not have a chief engineer position here at the Battleship. We do have a head of maintenance that falls under our operations department, but things like major work like this on the ship, redecking or dry docking, falls under curatorial. The battleship is an accessioned artifact in the museum's collection, and so as the museum's curator, I'm in charge of the preservation of the artifact. So I'm going to be the owner's rep to the yard while we're doing dry docking.
Well, I don't see any more questions in the chat room. Did we miss anything that you wanted to cover in today's presentation, Ryan?
I hope you guys can all fly out here and see us while we're in the yard. I look forward to giving you guys tours when you come out.
Yeah, it sounds really fascinating. If nothing else, we'll be following you on all of your social channels and YouTube to get the latest updates. I did want to thank everyone for joining us today. Just a reminder to follow us on social media. We'll be sharing this presentation and a follow-up survey from today's talk. If you have any more questions, you can feel free to reach out to us. Also, we are partnered with the Old Salt Coffee Company, and this every purchase of the Battleship blend of their coffee helps supports the restoration and preservation of the Mighty Mo. And I believe they also make donations to the USS New Jersey as well. So be sure to grab your next cup if you need it. And I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us for today's virtual presentation. Ryan, thank you so much for sharing everything that you did today. We really enjoyed it and hope to have you back soon. Best of luck with the dry dock.
Thank you so much. I'll see you guys all next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan.